You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio. So welcome everyone to another episode of Changing Reality. Welcome one, welcome all. We're so glad as always to have you here with us from WQHS Radio and from our show Changing Reality. So as always, Changing Reality is a show that features phenomenal people from all walks of life who are essentially changing their own reality. And through this show, we'll be hanging out and interviewing social change makers, entrepreneurs, business owners, to even artists, musicians, industry leaders, and inspiring individuals from all across the world, and many of whom from here who started off their journeys at the Pan campus as well. And by hearing these inspiring stories on how they are making waves in the lives of not only themselves, but those around them as well, I hope to uncover the little secrets and the little nuggets of wisdom that all of us can use in our own journeys to shorten our learning curves, to figure out what we want to do, and to hopefully plot out the course of the things that are most important to us and how we can achieve them. So I'm personally someone who truly believes in the power of stories. I wanted to do this show simply because I believe that there's so many brilliant people who, as I said, change the lives of not only themselves but those around them, and have these phenomenal stories that aren't often shared out there with the rest of the world. And I truly believe that by sharing these stories, all of us can benefit, all of us can grow, and it just makes the journey a lot less lonely and a lot more exciting. And to show you how powerful the power of stories has been in my own life, I actually personally founded and run a youth movement called Ascendance back at home in Malaysia, which is where I'm from, that today collaborates with not just our Malaysian Ministry of Education, but works with over 28 different countries to provide an alternative education platform for any student who wants to change their reality. And we work with students from elementary all the way up to college through various sessions, programs, experiential learning projects to help them discover their passion, learn about themselves and the world around them, and start their own careers while they're still in school to create meaningful impact to not just themselves, but those around them. And to date, we've been fortunate to work with over 35,000 students, 900 over schools and communities, and as I said, 28 over countries, helping students as young as 8 to 25 years old run their own social projects, their own social enterprises. And the basis for all of this has been stories. It's been kind individuals who've taken time out of their busy schedules to actually come and share their experiences, share the things that they are good at so that others may learn about it. And from there, we managed to create all of this impact. And again, I hope that this show serves as that same platform for all of you, so that through this show, you can explore in a small way the things that you want to do next and get a little bit of a glimpse on how you can start working towards it. So if there's anything that you want to talk about, specific industries, specific experiences, specific setbacks, make sure you let us know. You can drop it in our chat below. You can email us and reach out so that we can cater these stories to your experiences as well. And with that, that brings us to today's episode. We have a phenomenal guest speaker with us today. We have Douglas Cole, who is a sales leader at LinkedIn, an advisor with startup accelerators in Canada and the US, and a part-time university lecturer at the Rotman School of Management and several other executive education centers in Toronto and all over the world. With more than 20 years in consulting and sales, he has sold tens of millions of dollars in software as a service and advisory work, and holds an MBA from the Wharton School, a master's degrees from the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, and at the same time is someone who has actually written his own book called The Sales MBA. And it's a book that offers a fresh perspective in plain and direct language that shows how not only organizations evolve, how people make decisions, but also how everyday people reading the book can become a strategist, a change agent, and a decision architect in their own careers in a way. So make sure you guys check that out. But without further ado, let's meet the man behind all of this amazing work himself, Douglas Cole. So welcome him to our virtual stage. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Harsha. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to be able to have you on the show. I think when we chatted last, there was just so many interesting things in your story that I have no idea how we're going to fit it all in for our 45 minutes today, but I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experiences with us.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here.
Yep. So hopefully we didn't catch you on too busy of a day, all relaxing, all okay. I think it's the weekend, right, when we're having this.
Yeah, it's a Saturday, so It's a relatively calm time, so it's a perfect time to have this chat.
All right. Well, thank you so much for agreeing as well. And you have done so many things, I think, from advisory to sales, and you've even written a book about your experiences and the things that you've done in a way. You seem like the kind of person who has everything figured out in a sense. So from not only a successful career, but how you share that with others, how you help inspire and create value for others in their own learning journeys as well. I think that's something that all of us aspire to do, to not only be successful for ourselves, but to be able to be successful enough that we have insight to share with others. But so I'm very curious about you in a sense. You started as a student at Penn when you're doing your master's degree, but even before that, tell us a little bit about how you were like growing up. Did you know you would have this grand plan of all of the different things that you were doing, or did you start off doing something completely different?
Yeah, I definitely did not have a grand plan, and I think it's really important to dispel the myth or the expectation that one should have a grand plan. I think there's a very small percentage of people who are blessed with that kind of clarity early in their life, but I wasn't among them. And as I say, the majority of us are not among them. We don't have these things figured out. You need time to figure it out. And I was no different. When I started off to go to university, I had no idea. I had a variety of interests, a vague sense of what I was good at, but it really hadn't coalesced into any particular career ambition. And I think that I mean, for a long time, I was actually quite insecure about the fact that I didn't have a 5-year or 10-year plan. And it wasn't until maybe, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, something like that, where I totally changed my paradigm with respect to career thinking. I was heavily influenced by a couple of books on this topic. For example, Cal Newport's "So Good They Can't Ignore You" was a major influence. There were some others, but the essence of the paradigm shift that I made was to embrace the fact that having a plan was not necessary, and it was actually becoming increasingly irrelevant to have a plan, and just given the pace of change that we're all living through. And it just stands to reason that because of the velocity of change, to expect that you're going to be in a particular place in 5 years time or 10 years time doesn't actually make all that much sense, because I think it's just, you can't actually envision the potential roles for yourself, because many of those potential roles haven't even been created yet. So I took a very, very different approach quite consciously, and I decided that instead of having a focus on a 5-year, 10-year plan, that I would instead take a much shorter term focus and ask myself repeatedly, what are the skills and relationships that I'm continuously developing, and how does that create new layers of unique personal value because of the way in which I combine those skills and relationships. And that just became a fundamentally different way to approach career. It was much more liberating, frankly.
No, I think that's amazing, and I agree with you. Like I think me 5 years ago would not be able to predict what me 5 years later is doing, how the world is 5 years later. And I would say that I've never had a plan. I'd like to think or convince myself that I have some inkling of the future, but I really don't most of the time. And I feel like though many of us have broad goals of how we want to be, like the people we want to be, the things that we want to be able to achieve, there are, as you said, very little who actually have that planned out, and it's comforting to know that that it maybe is not the most important thing, like that we have to start thinking about now, especially entering college and all. I feel like many people have a plan, and that plan gets disrupted and destroyed leaving university and kind of entering the working world. So
Mhm.
one of the things that I think I really like when we first spoke was you mentioned something about when you were entering university, yes, in your undergrad year, you were focused more on kind of getting an education versus getting something specific out there for a job and career and all of that. And I find that very admirable. And I think that more people should have that focus going into any type of education. Tell me a little bit about how you were like as an undergrad. Were you as lost and confused as the rest of us? Or how was your experience curated by this idea that you wanted to have focus on your own kind of growth and learning and development versus just sticking to a plan that may not even work?
Yeah, well, I was definitely at least as confused as the average student. I think that the basic, to some extent, I was. maybe biased a little bit by the fact that I was more interested in the liberal arts compared to the sciences. I think it tends to be true that if people do have more of a scientific or hard sciences leaning, then they are more likely to think of university as a as a path to pursue a very particular career track. Whereas if you have a liberal arts background, you tend to be a little bit more expansive in terms of the way you view the future. But I think that regardless, I really, again, I think that most people just don't. Most people at the time they enter university, it's just, it's a little bit, take this the right way, but really, the average student knows very little about the world and about himself or herself, right? There's very little self knowledge, relatively speaking, and there's very little world knowledge. And so I think to arrive at university and assume that you've figured out exactly what you're going to do based on whatever you know at that time, it's actually it's quite a limited and fairly ignorant position to take. I think that you basically need to accept that you have only mastered a tiny sliver of what there is to know about the potential out there in the world, and also even in yourself. Many of us, I think, even up until the time we die, are mysteries to ourselves. There's so much going on in our own heads. I think I said to you in our last conversation that the human brain is well known to be the most complex organism in the known universe. And so it takes a lot of time to figure ourselves out. And I think university is a remarkable privilege that we have in the developed world to explore yourself and the world. And I think what that means, practically speaking, is that you should take as expansive an approach. You should take a very expansive approach to your education. You shouldn't assume that you're going in a certain direction. I would say that I think you should just try to cover as much as you can in both the arts and the sciences in order to understand what some of the smartest people in history, how they have confronted reality and how they have figured their own lives out. And you should just make it your mission to try to learn as much as possible rather than to specialize as much as possible within your time at university. So
No, that's a very good point. How do you do that in a sense? Because I feel like it's very easy to be intentional when you have like when you want to specialize, because that gives you kind of a scope. How do you intentionally find and like navigate the arts and humanities, or the additional things you want to learn about in a way that helps you explore yourself and the things
yeah.
that you are interested in? Because as you said, we go and we don't know really anything. How do you know what's the best for you? How did you find out?
I think one of the things that you need to do is you need to start cultivating, you need to become quite in touch with what is piquing your interest, what's causing you these little sparks of energy based on your exposure to different things. So if you are going through the description of different courses at university and you read a description which just causes you to stop and think for a minute and to imagine something, even for a minute or a second, that seems kind of exciting, that's something you want to pay attention to. And you want to go into whatever area that triggers some kind of spark within, because that energy is going to give you the necessary drive and curiosity to go deeper in that realm and to learn more within it. I mean, if you look at some of the examples, the famous example of Steve Jobs, when Steve Jobs was getting his education, he somehow was interested. He couldn't quite explain it to others or to himself, but he was interested in taking a calligraphy course. And so, here's this guy who became ultimately this Silicon Valley titan. But here he was sitting many years earlier in a arts class practicing his calligraphy. And that seemed kind of pointless, one would think at the time, but his taking that course was actually one of the most important influences as he developed the initial user interface for the Mac operating system. And he had a much stronger emphasis, in sharp contrast to Windows at the time. He had a much stronger emphasis on the aesthetics of the experience and sort of bringing that to the font design and so forth. So that's an example of how a lot of people who have had significant impact in the world, they do this. They notice that something gives them energy, something causes them intense curiosity, and they have the courage to pursue it, regardless of whether there is an immediate practical payoff. And when they do that repeatedly, it creates this interesting constellation of experiences and perspectives that that add up to their unique value in the world.
No, that's very, very well said, and I love that story about Steve Jobs. I think he's someone who gave some of the best speeches on his journey and his experiences in a way that makes sense. And I remember listening to that story before, and he'll say something. It's kind of like you can only connect the dots looking backwards, not forwards, in a way.
Right.
So it may seem random and
Yeah.
so on when you're going through it, but eventually it all kind of makes sense, which I thought was a bit sad to know that there is no hope for me figuring it out looking forward. But it is very comforting to think that one day a lot of the random things does make sense, and I think that we all see that in one way or another looking back. When you were in university, you studied, I think, like political science, English. I think those were some of your majors. How did you what was your experience in a sense in college, in a way, soaking all of this in and then making the decision of what you want to do next? How did you come about, like, the decision to enter the working world? You went into, I think, advisory and did an array of cool things. I also know that you would considering a career in academics right after university. So which way, kind of, like, how did you make your decision? Because again, hardest point I feel like every college student faces is that
Yeah.
decision also after everything's done and dusted, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, if I had to divide, let me just tell you the way the sort of 3-act play that I have lived through my own career, and then let me tell you what I think were sort of the retrospective means by which I made the pivot for each phase, and what I think might be applicable to someone who's starting out now. So, stage 1 was sort of random exploration. Stage 2 was consulting, and then stage 3, the one I'm in now, is sales and teaching. And I would say sales and entrepreneurship. Those would be the 3 themes: random exploration, consulting, sales, and entrepreneurship. So when I started the first phase of random exploration, it was, as the name suggests, a time where I was basically looking for any job that I could find through connections in the professional world, which would give me some type of exposure, some new skill, some new set of relationships. And so I did everything from working on a trading desk to working with a communications firm to working for a project management office to doing consulting projects in the nuclear energy space, and I did just all over the place, And I ultimately what the transition from that phase to the next one came about because toward the end of phase 1, I had started to go, not because I'd planned it, but I'd started inadvertently to go fairly deep in the area of energy, the energy space, and with quite a significant emphasis on nuclear energy. And I was getting boxed in. I was feeling myself increasingly restricted, by this degree of specialization, and I felt increasingly insecure about the fact that I had no technical training in this area, and yet I was, working on these projects with people who did have that background. And so I realized, okay, I need to expand my purview here. I need to go to an MBA program and figure out a way to go broader than this. So that's when I went to Wharton and Penn and did the Lauder program and the Wharton program, and then when I came out, I went into consulting. And consulting is, in a sense, it's a way to continue to defer your career decisions, because within consulting, you're basically allowed to be a generalist. You can cover multiple industries.
That's a good point. Yeah, I've not looked at it like that before, but okay, I like that way of thinking.
Yeah.
All right.
You can go in multiple industries, functions, teams, companies, whatever. You get this variety of experience, which is appealing to someone who wants to continue to roam, professionally speaking, right? So I did that in consulting for a while, and then ultimately I was given a choice, and the choice was you can either put on the golden handcuffs and become a partner, and commit yourself to the partner track, or do something else. And I looked ahead at the people who had made the choice to put on the handcuffs, and I just felt that they weren't particularly happy, and I couldn't really imagine myself in their shoes being happy. So at that point, I decided to just take a mid-career risk and just get out of consulting and try to get into entrepreneurship, join a company that was trying to disrupt the consulting space. And that didn't go so well, but it was still a good experience. And then I joined LinkedIn because I realized at that point that I had never been in tech and I'd never been in sales. And I was really struck by the fact that I had always noticed that the rate of growth within a company was probably the single most important variable that defined how exciting it was to work there. If it was a fast growing company, there was just more stuff going on, more things to do, more opportunities to try things out and expand your skill set. And I realized I knew nothing about the growth function. I knew nothing about sales. I'd never done any consulting projects on it. I'd never studied it in my MBA classes. And so I made it a point to try to learn this function in order to round out my business education. And then I discovered that sales was an interesting combination of strategy, psychology, and systems thinking, essentially. I think that the people who do well in sales, they are good at those three things, at least the people who are at the top of the game, whether we're talking about practitioners or leaders. Those are the areas they're really good at. And so I have found it to be an interesting area to go deeper on. Now, if I go back to the question, and I think you were asking, what are some practical pointers to convey to someone who's at that early stage, who's at that random exploration phase that I was talking about? And I would say, first of all, once again, don't be at all self-conscious about the fact that you're framing it as random exploration. That's totally fine and understandable. But two, I would say, just as a practical matter, be very intentional about each of the experiments that you're taking, each of the decisions that you make in that random exploration phase. Be very intentional about knowing what are the skills and relationships that I'm getting with this new decision I'm making, and what is the time limit I'm going to put on this step in order to decide whether it's something that it's worth sticking with, or something that's worth pivoting from. And I think if you hold yourself accountable to that discipline of just being quite clear about the net new skills and relationships that you're building, and continuously ask yourself what you have learned, you will start to develop this talent stack. You will start to layer on top of each experience an interesting new angle that you bring to the world.
Oh, very cool. And I love how you tied back the story to that, and I really like that. Tell me a little bit about your random exploration phase. You mentioned you've done everything from trading desk to nuclear, which is a bit of a range,
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that the first few jobs you get are normally, and I think this works for most people, from the connections, the network you have. Tell me a little bit about how you got that first role, and how did it feel, again, from college moving into the working world, and was it like something that came easy for you? Do you have an adjustment period?
Well, definitely an adjustment. I mean, I got the job through, I can't remember the specifics of the connections, but if it was through my university networks, and there were some type of personal connection to a firm that was actually the trading job that I got initially. And it was a very big adjustment. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, this goes to my point about trying to be very intentional, not only about the decision, but about the learnings from each of those stages within random exploration. And I remember when I was on that trading desk, I recall that there was a very distinctive feeling of working there. It was a very, very intense, fast-paced, adrenaline-driven experience. And the people who did, I started to notice that the people who did well, they had a certain thinking style. They had an ability to, because when you're working on a trading desk, at least at that time, you have to have this kind of lantern consciousness. You have to be aware of everything happening around you. You had to hear exactly what someone was saying across the desk on this corner, on that corner. You need to be able to pick up those nuances and just instantly relay that information to another trader who might benefit from the information, or one of your colleagues on the line in London or New York. And so it was just this hive mentality that I saw was kind of central to the role. And I realized that was just fundamentally different from the way my brain operated. That's not me at my best. I realized that this experience taught me that that's a very unnatural way of cognitive function for me. And so I would get lost in thought on things, and I would notice that I would miss certain signals that were coming through. And I realized that the reason for that was that cognitively, I was sort of made to focus on things deeply, that I liked to go deep on a certain topic. That's what gave me energy. And this other form of interaction was extremely draining and just really not how my brain was built. And that's why I got out, and that's why I started to get into areas that would allow me to go deeper on things. And it was interesting because the very first thing I had considered professionally speaking was academics. Because I had this interest in ideas and sort of exploring topics at depth, in depth. I thought, okay, well, academics is probably a natural path for me. But then I realized within my first few hours of being in the master's program that so many of these conversations were completely divorced from any practical utility. They were so speculative and so just so self-indulgent that I also learned from that I wanted to be doing something that could be road tested against reality. And so if you look at those two decisions, I completely pivoted. I mean, I overcorrected for the liabilities of academe by going into a trading desk, which had none of the things that I naturally wanted to do. But it was a good experience. It was a good way to highlight who I was as a person and what kind, the type of work experience that would resonate with me. But it's an example of what I'm saying, of how the exploration, if you do it in a very intentional way, and you do reflect on what you learn, it starts to come together as to where you should be focusing your energy.
No, and I like how in the story, in your experience, it's kind of like you figure yourself out, not always through I wouldn't say the worst of experience, but always through the best of experiences. And I feel like that is something that we are all kind of afraid of. Like, I don't know, personally, I feel like I learn the most about myself in situations where I figure out, oh, this doesn't really work for me. As you said, this doesn't really work for the way that I'm thinking. This is maybe not the type of work that gives me the most energy. But I'm also at the same time parallel terrified of not being the best, of not doing good enough, and all of that. And I feel like that is something salient for many, like Gen Z out there, and many students right now as well. It's that on one side we are terrified of not being the best in what we're doing, and in not being able to cope in an environment. But on the other side, it's like, don't those environments where we don't fit in just teach us a little bit more about ourselves? And doesn't that just teach us, like they said, it's just another way that doesn't work? They say, like Edison and the light bulb, you just figure out one way that it doesn't work, and then there's still so many other ways that you can try. So how do you balance kind of like the feeling that, oh, what, this doesn't work for me, is there something wrong with me, versus the feeling that, oh, you know what, this just taught me that this is not the thing for me, what do I do next? Is this something that you struggle with? Because it's something that I struggle with, and I feel that it is something that most people do. But how do you kind of manage yourself to be able to see the lesson and not get caught up in kind of the your own insecurities?
Yeah, I'm very naturally drawn to mental models in thinking about any challenging question such as that. And so the one that comes to my mind is, you must be familiar, well, maybe not, but there's a very well-known book by this guy with this almost unpronounceable or unspellable last name, and it's called his last name is Csikszentmihalyi. That's how you pronounce it.
Oh yeah, I know positive psychology. Go ahead. Yeah, I study, but that's my major. So yes.
Right. So he wrote this wonderful book back in the 80s called Flow. And that book was a study of creative people. And he was trying to figure out what made creative people tick and how they operated at their best. And he, just to put it in really simple terms, I'm doing the book some sort of injustice, but basically what he said was, these creative people, they manage to achieve a state of flow, which he regards as the perfect midpoint between effort and ease. When you're when you're doing something that requires too much effort, it becomes really stressful and overwhelming. When you're doing something that requires too little effort, it becomes boring. And when you're right in between those two poles, when you're right at the center, then you are in this state that he calls flow. Now, the reason that comes to mind is that I think that this model of flow, I think it applies to career in two respects. I think ultimately, once you sort of figure out an area, what your general area of focus ought to be professionally speaking, then you're looking to get at that midpoint. You're looking to arrive at that midpoint where you are sort of pushing yourself and you just feel most alive at that intersection. But I think before you figure that question out, if we use the same model, I think you want to err on the side of effort and discomfort as you go through the exploration phase. I think that you need to be trying things out that are putting you that are causing some degree of fear and anxiety and insecurity. It's a very delicate point because, as my experience with the trading desk showed, that that was a quite extreme step that I took in joining
From
that.
academia to trading, yeah.
There was no ease in it whatsoever. It was pure effort and stress. And for that reason, I learned the lesson very quickly. But I think you want to be testing yourself, testing your interest, and testing your abilities by actually quite deliberately putting yourself in situations that are challenging and frustrating, and that do force you to feel, or do force you to cause you some degree of discomfort and insecurity, because you're not really going to be learning anything unless you're doing that. So I think that's sort of that's one of the core criteria when you are in the random exploration phase is again, pursuing these new skills and relationships, but in a way that guarantees that you're feeling discomfort, and that you are just made aware daily that you're a work in progress, as we all are, and just understand that this is when growth happens. Growth does not happen when things are easy and when you're in a groove. Growth happens when you stress the limits of your mind and your muscles, whatever the case may be. It's all the same. You have to put stress on the vehicle.
Yep. And I think part of, again, we're not going to try to pronounce his name right, Dr. Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think one of the things I really liked about him is he said that state of flow, that state of engagement, is one of the things that in positive psychology in general is essential for well-being. Like you're only going to be a overall happy and holistic person if you have in some capacity that level of engagement in something in your life, that level of flow. Tell me a little bit about, in your experience, where do you feel that you have felt that kind of balance between the pushing yourself and also that ease and effort in a sense? And how do you think it being in a situation like that has shaped you? What's your favorite experience in flow in a sense?
Well, maybe the experience of writing the book has been an example of that, because it sort of ties together a whole bunch of things. When I decided I was going to write the book, I remembered a piece of advice that a famous writer once gave. I think it was Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. He said that you shouldn't attempt to write a book until you decided that the pain of writing the book is going to be less than the pain of not writing the book. That's when you should sit down and try to plan to do it. And I had reached the point where I realized that I had to do something that was going to cause me more frustration not to write. And so what had happened was I was at LinkedIn, and I had spent a lot of time building this mini MBA for sales within the company, and I was testing the material out with different classes and getting lots of feedback, and I was iterating it, and I was testing the same course content out with some of my external engagements, with business schools and such, and with startup accelerators. And so I eventually realized that I had to do something with this. I had to codify these learnings in the form of a book. And so that was, I think, a perfect example of pursuing a state of flow. I knew that it would be very difficult. It would be tough going. I knew that it would require, I'd have to take time away from work. I'd have to sort of devote 3 months to just writing. I knew I'd have to put together an outline before I even started. I knew there would be a lot of editing, and it just, you could see there was going to be a ton of work. But I was really animated by a future vision of what could be good. I think that is one of the things that when you think of a flow experience, there is some future that you're working towards, and that gives you energy, for one thing. And then there is something about the process itself that you find intrinsically rewarding, regardless of the future outcome. So I remember distinctly being in this state of, sitting at a cafe or something and trying to do some writing for this book, and knowing that it was just one small step towards the ultimate outcome, and knowing that there were many more steps to go, but just being able to appreciate the joy and the satisfaction in that moment of adding just a little bit more clarity to the message and to the unfolding of the ideas of the book, that it was always enjoyable. Like even though it was work every day, and even though I was sacrificing revenue because I was taking time off work to do this, there were still these moments of fulfillment and joy every day in the service of that longer term goal. So I think that for me has been the most recent and memorable example of flow, and it sort of brings together what it is that I feel that I can do in this world, and it brings together my sense of how the future could be better, and it brings together my unique understanding of the value I can bring to the human community. I think that's sort of what's driving the feelings of fulfillment in the moment.
No, I think that's very beautifully put, and I feel, as you said, a part of what makes us human is the ability to feel that we are giving back to the community, that we are
Right.
kind of in a way imparting that experience. Moving into the book itself, there are so many amazing stories that you share throughout the book that are essentially embedded in the text that I find personally very fascinating. I think I was just earlier reading a part where I think I was on the part where you share about kind of the mindset in chapter 2 or 3, I'm not sure. And then you share about this example of how there's this lady you spoke to on the phone, and she basically tells you something like, you know what, like the only reason I picked up this call is because you managed to get through the screening process by like accidentally. Like I did not want to pick up this call in the first place. And I really like those examples, those stories that you've had, that you share in a sense. And given that we've been talking about mindset so much, I think it's important to bring that up, because as you say, and as probably most people who experience and do sales would know, half of the like sales is a very terrible, I wouldn't say terrible, but it is a very punishingly paced job at times. You don't always like stop and smell the roses, or even if you do, you get more rejections than you get yeses in a day.
Mm-hmm.
How
Mm-hmm.
do you, as someone who got into sales, like because you wanted to learn about this industry, you wanted to learn about this field within the tech space and all of that, what were your initial experiences with sales, and how did you kind of adapt to this career that was very, I would say, very people facing, very high rejection facing?
Yeah, well, that's a good description. I like your choice of words there. It is a punishing profession. Yeah,
That was one you liked? Okay, sure.
yeah, yeah. It is. But as we were saying, you don't grow unless you're experiencing some degree of pain and discomfort. And I think that there is, sales, of course, as most people know, is a profession that has had a bit of a branding problem for a while, and which is one of the reasons why it isn't as prominently featured in business school curricula as it might be, or in a way that reflects its actual prominence in the economy. And I think that what I've observed is what I've actually experienced, and what I've observed is that these frustrations that you're talking about are intrinsic to the profession, especially in the early years. You develop ways of handling this stuff much better with time, but it's certainly unavoidable. And I think that is, I would suggest, one of the distinctive virtues of the profession, in the sense that it does. Sales is a professional experience that teaches you a kind of professional skill set that's very difficult to come by in another realm. So I think, for one thing, it teaches you. It really forces you to become a full owner of your destiny. You realize pretty early on that you're not going to be able to rely on anyone to succeed. You yourself are the CEO of your territory. You are the master of your destiny, and you need to find ways to ensure that your effort delivers revenue, and for which which is how you're paid. You're only paid based on what you accomplish, and so you're given this obvious incentive to figure things out for yourself, and just to kind of step up to the challenge. So there's this really, really palpable sense in which it forces you to become an owner of your destiny, professionally speaking. The other thing it really teaches you is, in order to succeed in that way, you have to be very acutely aware of other people's perspectives. You have to learn what it means to properly empathize with another person, to stand in their shoes, to see the world as they see it, to be able to figure out exactly what it is that's driving that person at the deepest level, in terms of their own resistance or uncertainty or rejection. So it teaches you that empathy. And the last thing that it teaches you is, it teaches you, again, through the school of hard knocks, it teaches you how to prioritize, because you realize, in a sales role, that you have a certain amount of time. It's usually, within the quarter, to deliver those results, and you don't have time to mess around. You've got to get there somehow. And so you become really good at deciding what to ignore, what to focus on, and what's the 80-20 that you're going to apply to your book of business. These three things, ownership, empathy, and prioritization, are, it's not that no other area of life teaches you that. Entrepreneurship would teach you many of those things as well. I wouldn't say that they're, the lessons are absent in other fields, but you learn them really quickly in a sales role. And I think that it's actually one of the reasons why people who have been through sales have developed a kind of professional maturity much faster as a result. So yeah, that's what I would say about the experience.
Amazing. And as we kind of wind down our conversation, maybe we can end on the note of, tell us the biggest failure, the biggest success, and the biggest lesson you learned from each of them in your journey in sales so far.
Well, okay, the biggest failure, let's see. I would say the biggest failure
or setback. It's a nicer word, setback. Yeah.
I can recall the biggest failure. There was a time when I was working on this one deal, and I went to go and speak to this chief revenue officer about the program they had with us. And I'd been working with someone who reported to him, who struck me as being obviously incompetent. And I say obviously because many other people in the company I'd spoken to agreed with me that this person was incompetent, and it was a mystery to many that this person was in role. It seemed to be some type of personal connection or something that explained it. So I remember I went to go and talk to this person's boss, again the chief revenue officer, and I sat down, and I was really pleased with myself that I'd got this meeting with the CRO. And so we sat down, and I had this conversation about the program, and the sort of I was offering my recommendation on what needed to be done, and I remember at some point I mentioned it. I made some sort of disparaging comment in passing about this person who worked for the CRO, and I remember, and then a couple weeks later, I found out that this person had heard what I said, and in fact, I was confronted directly by that person, and was forced to justify myself. And that was a big failure, because that was actually a really stupid thing to do. It was not a good judgment on my part to have said that. It almost cost me it didn't actually cost the sale, but it very nearly did. And I think what I learned from that was that it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that within an organization, it's almost the way people think about things, the way people make decisions is very, very deeply entwined. It's like this social process where people's perspectives are significantly shaped by where they are in the hierarchy and how they relate to other people. And it's impossible for people it's very difficult for people to step outside of that ecosystem and take an objective view on what's actually happening in that ecosystem, because they're so embedded within that social frame, they're so enmeshed in the social ecosystem. And I had made this assumption that I could offer a comment on that organization, that will be taken seriously, even though I was a total outsider. And I will never do that again. I will always assume that there's an intrinsic merit to the perspective of someone within that organization, regardless of what an outsider thinks, because of the nuances of that company and how things might make sense internally, even though they don't make sense to an outside person. And so I will always defer to, these community norms and perspectives within the company, which become entrenched because of that system.
But that is a very, very good lesson and a very, very good point. I'm reflecting on it right now. Like, wow.
Yeah. So anyway, that was a big lesson. And then I guess a big win, I will go back to I think the book project that I've just described is an example of how to find energy within and how to channel that energy within in a way that makes the best use of your unique talents for the benefit of the broader community. So that's what I would say.
Amazing. And if you had to, and final question, like if you had to do, or if you could spread one piece of advice or one I would say cheat code, and how do you figure that out for yourself? How do people kind of learn about themselves and figure out what gives them energy, or learn these lessons and be able to stay put in a sense in these uncomfortable situations? What do you think enables a person to be able to do all of this, to be able to reflect on themselves? Because the thing about your journey that really strikes me personally is the amount of reflection and the amount of learning you do in the experiences in every step of the way. So what do you think enables a person to do that, and how can we start doing that more in our own careers?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on it. You're touching on what is the core point here, which is that any kind of learning in life, whether it's learning about yourself or learning about any domain, requires you to take some sort of bold step, to experience the consequences of that step, and then to force yourself to pause and reflect on what just happened. That's how learning happens in any domain. And unless you make this part of your operating system, as it were, and unless you have a regular means, whether it's quarterly or monthly or weekly or annually or all the above, you do need to build in these reflection periods within your system to ensure that you are looking back and saying, what just happened here? What was I trying to do? In the military, they have this thing called after action reviews, which is in the U.S. military, where they use it to just continuously improve their abilities. So if they're doing a mission, when they practice the Osama bin Laden raid, for instance, they practice they would do the practice. They would have a certain intention for that practice, and then they would all gather around and say, well, okay, did we achieve what we set out to do? If so, why? If not, why? Right? And that's kind of that whole after action review discipline is what you need to make habitual in your own life in order to get continuously better.
No, I think that's a very, very nicely said point. And I think it's something that we can learn and embed slowly into our own lives. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for this whole conversation. I think it is something that people really struggle with kind of pinpointing themselves. So I'm really, really glad that you actually came on the show and shared this, because it is so, so essential. And I think at the end of the day, a huge part of career, a huge part of life in general is being able to learn from yourself. And by being able to see how you can do that through your career makes the whole process so much more meaningful. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming on board and sharing all of this.
Thank you, Harsha. Great to talk to you, and congrats on doing great work. I think you're finding your groove.
Well, thank you. That's very, very kind of you. And to our audience, I hope that you guys are able to, through this show and through this conversation, reflect on this in your own life, and also be able to take a step back and do the after action review, and then make sure that you can see the lessons in your own life and journey as well. So with that, our show today has come to an end. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you, Douglas, once again for being our speaker on the show. And with that, we'll see you guys next round. As always, this has been Changing Reality. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
You're listening to Changing Reality.
Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio.